In October 2023, something happened that defense analysts have been waiting decades to see. Out on the grey waters off of the Japanese coast, a ship called JS Asuka fired a gun. Not a particularly large gun, 40mm, about the width of a golf ball. But this gun didn't use gunpowder. It did something really, really cool. It used electricity. A 5 megajoule pulse from a bank of capacitors dumped into 2 parallel rails in a fraction of a second, accelerating a small metal dart to around 2,230 meters per second. That's roughly Mach 6.5, about twice as fast as the fastest rifle bullets. So really bloody quick. It was the first time in history that a railgun had been fired from a ship at sea. And then in 2025, they did it again. Same ship, same gun, but this time they actually pointed it at something. A target vessel under tow, and they hit it many, many times, putting many, many holes in it. This is the weapon that navies have been dreaming about for over a century. Hypersonic projectiles that cost almost nothing compared to missiles. Plus, there's no explosive propellant to cook off if you take a hit. You've got unlimited ammunition, theoretically, as long as you've got electricity and some metal. It's all rather fantastic. Indeed, the United States Navy spent 15 years on somewhere north of $500 million trying to make a railgun work. They got some spectacular test footage, but they never got a gun on a ship, with the program quietly shelved in 2021. China reportedly mounted something railgun-shaped on a landing ship a few years back, but we never saw anything much come from it. And yet, here's Japan, a country that technically doesn't even call its navy a navy, with a working electromagnetic cannon bolted to the deck of a test ship, firing hypersonic rounds into the hulls of target vessels. So how'd that happen? How did a mid-sized naval power leapfrog everybody else? What does the gun actually do, and what is it for? And also, is this the moment railguns finally move from concept art to the front line, or is this just another really, really expensive America $500 million dead end? Today we're looking at Japan's electromagnetic railgun program, the experimental ship JS Asuka, and what might be the most significant development in naval gunnery since the missile made big old guns obsolete. Just before we continue with today's video, quick word from our friends over at AG1, and by friends I mean the sponsor of this video. Winter is all about habit stacking up, isn't it? Staying inside, not getting enough exercise, eating a bit too much, drinking a bit too much, just me. But AG1 is a habit that I've put in my rotation. I've had it in my rotation for years now, and it's one that I have stuck with. It is a daily health drink with over 75 ingredients and 5 probiotic strains, clinically shown to support your gut health. And yeah, I don't know, it's been so long that I've been on it now that I've forgotten what it's like not on it. But I don't know, I got good ass digestion. I eat my food, it goes down nicely, it comes out the other side as it's supposed to. I'm probably not supposed to be saying this in the advert. What I'm going to do is pivot to actually drinking some, which is supposed to be in the advert. It tastes like pineapple. It tastes a little bit like vanilla. It tastes good, kind of sweet, but not too sweet. It doesn't taste as green as it looks. It replaces your multivitamin, your probiotics, and about 3 other things that I was never consistent with anyway. Those little pills that's like, oh yeah, no, I forgot. Yeah, for like 5 days. If you want to make a full routine, AGZ is their nighttime blend, which is good for winding down. So, through my link, you get 3 free AG1 travel packs, which I have. These things, and this is the vitamin D3 and K2, which is useful if you don't go outside much like me. Plus you get a welcome kit with your subscription. All you need to do is go to drinkag1.com/megaprojects or click the link in the description below. And now back to today's episode. The big problem. Alright, to understand why Japan is pouring resources into an electromagnetic cannon, you need to understand the problem that they are trying to solve, and that problem starts with those missiles we just mentioned. You see, for most of the 20th century, naval warfare was dominated by big guns on big ships making big bangs. Battleships lobbed shells the size of small cars at each other from a long way away, and whoever had the bigger gun and the thicker armor generally won. But after World War II, guided missiles changed everything. Suddenly, you didn't need a 16-inch gun and a crew of thousands to sink a capital ship. You needed a relatively little missile with a guidance system launched from a destroyer, an aircraft, or even just a truck on the shore. The gun age gave way to the missile age, and navies around the world raced to fill their ships with vertical launch cells packed with guided weapons. Here's the thing about missiles, though. They are really, really f***ing expensive. A single SM-2 interceptor costs somewhere north of $1 million. The newer SM-6, which can handle faster and more complex targets, runs closer at $4 to $5 million per shot. A modern destroyer can only carry so many of these as well, typically between 90 and 120 vertical launch cells, which is an extraordinary amount of money, and those cells have to be able to handle everything from air defense to anti-submarine rockets to land attack cruise missiles. Oh, and you can't reload them at sea. Once you've fired what you've got, you're heading back to port to get some more. Now think about what happens if someone decides to throw a lot of missiles at you all at once. This is something that military planners have a word for. It's called a saturation attack, and it's become the defining nightmare of modern naval warfare. The idea is a really simple one. A ship can only engage, say, a dozen incoming missiles at the same time. If you launch 50 missiles, some of those missiles are gonna get through, and if each of your interceptors costs $4 billion, while the attacker's cruise missiles cost a few $100,000 each, well, you've got an economic program really fast, don't you? And well, this is the strategic environment Japan finds itself in. To the west, China has spent 2 decades building up one of the largest missile arsenals on the planet, including anti-ship ballistic missiles designed specifically to keep American and Allied warships at arm's length, plus hypersonic glide vehicles that can maneuver unpredictably at speeds up to Mach 5. To the north, North Korea keeps adding to its own stockpile of ballistic missiles. Japan, of course, sits within range of all of it, and its maritime self-defense forces are central to any plan for defending the sea lanes and island chains that define the region. And that brings us back to the topic today, that railgun. You see, on paper, an electromagnetic gun solves almost every problem in that equation. The projectiles, they're hypersonic, fast enough to catch most airborne threats. They're inert metal, no explosive warhead, which means no volatile propellant magazine waiting to blow the up inside your boat if you take a hit. And the ammunition is really cheap. A shaped metal dart costs a tiny fraction of what a guided missile costs, and your magazine depth is limited only by how much electricity your ship can generate and how many slugs you can stack in it. That means that defending against a saturation attack stops being a question of, do we have enough interceptors, and starts being a question of, can we keep the capacitors charged? If so, we're going to be fine. So yeah, that's the promise, that these things do have a tendency to not really work very well at all. Railguns 101. Okay, so let's now talk about how these things actually work, shall we? A railgun is at its core quite a simple idea. You take 2 parallel metal rails, usually copper or a copper alloy, and you run them down the length of a barrel. At the back, you place a conductive projectile, called an armature by the way, that bridges the gap between the 2 rails, completing an electrical circuit. Then you dump an absolutely enormous amount of energy into that whole thing. When that current flows up one rail, crosses the armature, back down the other, it creates a powerful magnetic field between the rails. That magnetic field interacts with the current flowing through the armature, and the result is something called a Lorentz force, a shove of pure electromagnetic energy that accelerates the projectile forward along the rails and out of the barrel at tremendous speed, and, well, off it goes to ruin someone's day. Simple, in theory. Right? I mean, I feel like Mark Rober could probably build one of these in a weekend. The problem is, simple in theory and actually works reliably are very different things when you're talking about the kind of energies involved here. A conventional naval gun fires shells at maybe 800 to 900 meters per second. Fast? Yep, but certainly not fast enough to catch a hypersonic missile. A railgun can launch projectiles at 2,000 meters per second or more. It's 2 kilometers a second. Like, that's like 1.5 miles Americans. That's Mach 6 or Mach 7, depending on the design, which is fast enough to intercept things that conventional guns simply cannot touch, and it means the projectile carries enormous kinetic energy even without an explosive payload. A small metal dart moving at those speeds hits with the force of a much larger conventional round. And because you're not limited by the sizes of expensive missile tubes, your effective magazine is as deep as your power supply and your stack of slugs. In theory, you could fire hundreds of rounds in a sustained engagement and not run dry. But you're probably beginning to see the problem. All of this just sounds perfect, and railguns have sounded perfect for a really long ass time. The basic physics has been understood since the 19th century. Scientists and military planners have been kicking around practical railgun concepts since at least the 1940s. So why isn't every navy in the world already using them? The physics tax. Well, the first problem's power. To accelerate a projectile to Mach 6 or 7, you need to dump an enormous amount of energy into those rails in a really short period of time, several megajoules delivered in a matter of milliseconds. That kind of instantaneous power does not come from a standard ship's electrical system. You need massive banks of capacitors that can charge up slowly and then discharge all at once, plus the switching gear and cabling to handle currents that would just vaporize ordinary wiring. Early railgun power systems were the size of shipping containers. Fitting them onto a warship alongside everything else a warship needs was challenging, to put it mildly. The second problem is what happens inside the barrel when you actually fire the thing. You've got a metal projectile sliding along metal rails at hypersonic speeds with millions of amps of current flowing through the contact points. The friction is immense. So's the heat. Every single shot ablates the surface of the rails, gouging and warping the metal, degrading the precise engineering that the whole system depends on. Fire enough rounds and your rails get pretty ruined, which isn't great for future usage. And that leads directly to the third problem, the rate of fire. If your barrel is essentially a consumable that wears out after 30 or 40 shots, then your effective rate of fire drops to whatever pace lets you swap barrels in the middle of a fight. Which is to say, no pace at all. A railgun that can fire one spectacular shot and then needs maintenance isn't really much of a weapon. A railgun that can fire continuously, shot after shot, minute after minute, while enemy missiles are streaking towards your ship, now that's a weapon. And for decades, nobody could figure out how to make the barrels last long enough to matter. The cautionary tales. Alright, so the most famous attempt was the US Navy's electromagnetic railgun program, which ran in earnest from the mid-2000s through to 2021. They built test rigs that could hurl projectiles at Mach 7. They produced dramatic footage of sabots streaking downrange in balls of fire. They talked about 100 nautical mile ranges and rates of fire that would make a conventional gun crew weep with envy. The goal was an enormous one. A 150mm 32 megajoule monster that could replace traditional naval gunfire support entirely. And to that, all we can say is, holy shit, that would be ridiculous. But alas, reality showed up. The barrels wore out after a few dozen shots at full power. The power systems were enormous beasts that didn't fit neatly onto existing ship designs. The rate of fire never got close to what you would need for practical air defense. In 2021, the Navy pulled the plug and redirected the money toward hypersonic missiles. No American warship ever sailed with a working railgun on deck. The Americans weren't the only ones trying, though. China reportedly mounted something railgun-shaped on a landing ship called the Haiyang Shan back in 2018. Photos did circulate online showing a large turret with cables snaking across the deck, and defense analysts spent weeks trying to figure out what they were looking at. After the initial excitement, nothing followed. No announcements, no test footage, no operational deployment. Then over in Europe, the French-German Research Institute of St. Louis, known as ISL, has been quietly plugging away at electromagnetic launch technology for years, operating small caliber lab launchers and contributing to the theoretical groundwork. And yeah, it's useful research, sure, but these are all laboratory experiments rather than anything approaching a deployable weapon. And that's really the key point. Until very recently, nobody had publicly demonstrated a railgun firing from a ship that was actually floating in the ocean, dealing with all the vibration, power fluctuations, and environmental chaos that comes with being at sea. That particular milestone belonged to exactly one country that wasn't any of the usual suspects, and you know who it is, because it's the title of this video. We've mentioned it many times. It's Japan. Japan's railgun program. Japan's railgun story starts much earlier than most people actually realize. Back in the 1990s, researchers at what would eventually become ATLA, the Acquisition, Technology and Logistics Agency, Japan's defense R&D arm, were already tinkering with electromagnetic launch at the Ground Systems Research Center. These were not weapons in any practical sense. They were tiny 16mm bore test rigs, the kind of thing you'd find in a university physics lab, designed to help engineers understand the basic behavior of projectiles under electromagnetic acceleration. It was foundational work, the sort of slow, methodical research that doesn't make headlines, but quickly builds the knowledge base you need before you can attempt anything more ambitious. For years, that's where Japan's railgun program stayed. Small scale, academic papers, incremental progress. Nobody was talking about putting these things on a ship. That changed around 2015, 2016. The Japanese Ministry of Defense had been watching what was happening elsewhere, the American program with its impressive test shots and equally impressive problem. And why they decided it was time that they got serious. Officials conducted a formal survey of global railgun work, assessed where the technology stood, and kicked off a full-scale development program with actual military applications in mind. The stated goals were clear and pragmatic. First, increase projectile velocity. Second, improve rail durability, solve the barrel wear problem that had plagued everyone else. And third, build a medium-caliber railgun that could eventually be deployed on ships or land-based platforms. This wasn't blue sky research anymore. This was a weapons program with a destination. The 40mm gun that changed everything. The centerpiece of the new program was a 40mm medium-caliber railgun, and this is the weapon that would eventually make history on Asuka. The projectiles it fires are essentially metal darts, about 16 centimeters long, weighing roughly 320 grams, about the same as a full can of soda. The Atla has tested two main types, a single-piece steel dart and a composite armor-piercing round. Neither one contains any explosive filler because that's just unnecessary at these speeds. That 320-gram dart leaves the barrel carrying roughly the same kinetic energy as a heavy car traveling at highway speeds, except all of that energy is concentrated into a nose the size of a single fingertip. But the real headline wasn't the speed, it was the durability. Atla announced that the 40mm prototype had fired 120 consecutive rounds of velocities above 2,000 meters a second with limited rail damage. 120 shots, all at operational speeds, and the barrel was still usable afterward. For a technology that had killed programs because barrels wore out after a few dozen firings, this was a real breakthrough. Whatever the Japanese team were doing differently was absolutely working. Two engineering obsessions defined the Japanese approach, and they explain why this program succeeded while others stalled. The first was barrel life, naturally. Atla's engineers attacked the erosion problem from multiple angles, experimenting with rail materials, armature designs, and the way current flows through the system during firing. The details remain closely guarded, but symposium photographs showed rail segments near the breach, the area that typically takes the worst punishment. They were looking remarkably clean after those 120 shots. The worst damage in earlier American tests had occurred at precisely that critical start point where the current density is highest. The Japanese had clearly found ways to manage the thermal and electrical stresses that defeated those earlier designs. The second obsession was miniaturization. A railgun is useless if the power system is so enormous you can't fit it on a ship. Japan's answer was a power module built around ceramic film capacitors and gallium oxide power electronics, components that can handle extreme voltages and currents while taking up far less space than older technologies. The whole system was designed to fit into a standard shipping container, which made it much easier to transport and install on a test vessel. But that's just the starting point. Atla's official roadmap calls for shrinking the charger volume by around 50% over 5 years and reducing capacitor volume by roughly 90% over the next decade. If they hit those targets, future versions could fit comfortably on frontline destroyers or even land-based vehicles. Learning from other people's expensive mistakes. Now, Japan didn't figure this all out in isolation. From late 2023 through mid-2024, Atla seconded an engineer to a US Navy research institute to study American electromagnetic weapons up close. A Japanese researcher walking through the test halls where the Americans had spent years chasing the railgun dream, poring over the data from a program that had ultimately been shelved, trying to extract every possible lesson about what went wrong and why. Why did the materials fail? What power architectures proved unworkable? I mean, the Americans might have given up on their railgun, but the knowledge they accumulated was really expensive knowledge that shouldn't die with the program. And then in 2024, Japan signed a trilateral cooperation agreement with France and Germany, working through the ISL Research Institute. The agreement covers knowledge sharing on railguns and hypersonic projectiles, giving Japan access to decades of European research while contributing its own breakthroughs to the partnership. By 2022, the program had matured enough to enter a new phase, officially designated Research on Future Railgun in Ministry of Defense documents. The timeline runs through roughly 2026, and the focus has shifted significantly. Early work, you see, was all about the launcher itself. Could you build rails that survived? Could you generate enough power? Could you achieve the velocities you needed? Now, though, The emphasis is on turning that launcher into a complete weapon system. That means continuous fire rather than single shots, the ability to keep pulling the trigger without waiting minutes between rounds for capacitors to recharge. It means fire control integration, connecting the gun to radars and targeting computers so that it can actually hit something that's moving at hypersonic speeds. And it means projectile stability and aerodynamics, ensuring the rounds fly true after leaving the barrel instead of tumbling around and losing energy. They're aiming for a small caliber ship-based anti-ship prototype around 2027. By 2028, the goal is a medium caliber air defense version suitable for ships, land-based platforms, or vehicles. But before any of that could happen, Japan needed to prove the concept worked at sea. They had a gun that performed impressively on land. Now they needed a ship big enough, weird enough, to bolt it onto and sail it out into the ocean. JS Asuka, the floating laboratory. JS Asuka is one of the strangest ships in any Navy's fleet, and that is precisely why she was perfect for this job. Launched in 1994 and commissioned the following year, Asuka is Japan's dedicated experimental vessel, a one-of-a-kind ship whose entire purpose is to test equipment that isn't ready for frontline service yet. She's around 151 meters long and displaces somewhere between 4,250 and 6,200 tons, depending on what's bolted onto her at any given time, which varies, of course, depending on her role. The propulsion system is a cog-lag arrangement, combined gas turbine electric and gas turbine. If you're wondering, I wasn't writer, but I guess now I know. Built around two General Electric LM2500 gas turbines, the same gas engines that power warships all over the world. She can move when she needs to, but speed is not really the point. The point is providing a stable, well-equipped platform where engineers can try things that might not work. Over her 3 decades of service, she's been the testing ground for an extraordinary range of technologies. The FCS-3 radar system, which now forms the backbone of air defense on Japan's Aegis equivalent destroyers, that was tested on Asuka. The QQQ series sonar system, also tested on Asuka. The Type 07 vertical launch anti-submarine rockets, the Type 12 torpedo, the Type 12 surface-to-ship missile, all of them were on this experimental ship before they entered frontline service. By the early 2020s, the railgun program was ready for exactly that kind of test. And Asuka was ready to receive the strangest cargo of her long career. Installing the railgun on the Asuka is definitely not a subtle operation. If you look at photographs of the ship in her current configuration, the first thing you notice is the turret sitting on the rear deck ahead of the superstructure. It's a boxy, angular housing weighing roughly 8 tons with a 6-meter barrel protruding from the front. It looks less like a traditional naval gun and more like something from a science fiction stat, all hard edges and industrial purpose. Behind the turret, clustered on the deck, sit several large shipping containers. One houses the charger units and power electronics, the gallium oxide switches and control systems that manage the flow of electricity. 3 more hold the capacitor banks capable of storing the energy needed and dumping into the rails in the instant of firing. The power flow is exactly how you'd expect. Asuka's gas turbine generators feed electrical power into the charging system. The chargers slowly fill the capacitor banks over seconds or minutes. Then, when the trigger is pulled, all of that stored energy dumps into the rails in milliseconds, accelerating the projectile from 0 to max 6.5 before it clears the barrel. Asuka was ideal for this precisely because she was built to handle the unexpected. Unlike a frontline destroyer where every square meter is accounted for, Asuka has room for containerized equipment that doesn't fit anywhere else, plus a complement of technical staff whose entire job is babysitting experimental systems. When something goes wrong, and with cutting-edge technology things always go wrong, there are engineers on board who can diagnose the problem, tweak the settings, and give it another shot, if you'll excuse the pun. Admirals on deck. The program's importance definitely wasn't lost on Japan's senior naval leadership. In April 2025, Vice Admiral Katsushi Amachi, commander of the self-defense fleet, made a point of visiting Asuka personally to inspect the railgun installation and observe preparations for the upcoming sea trials. He came back again later in 2025 after the system had proven itself. Around the same time, Chief of Staff Admiral Saito also boarded the experimental ship to see the weapon firsthand. Japan's top naval officers were personally investing their time and attention in a weapon system that most of the world's navies had just given up on. And the railgun isn't even the only experimental weapon the Asuka is carrying. Elsewhere on her deck, housed in distinctive dome modules, sits a 100-kilowatt laser weapon developed jointly by Kawasaki Heavy Industries and Atla. The laser is designed to track and burn through targets at the speed of light. drones, small boats, possibly even incoming missiles, which is very cool, but definitely something that we could touch on in another video. With the hardware in place, and the admirals suitably impressed, there was only one thing left to do: sail the ship out, charge those capacitors, and pull the trigger. Probably not literally, it's probably a button. In October 2023, Atlas made an announcement that rippled through defense circles around the world. Working alongside the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, they had successfully conducted the first shipboard firing of an electromagnetic railgun in history. And to be clear about what this test was and wasn't, Asuka sailed out to a designated test area, the crew charged the capacitors, and they fired the 40mm railgun into open water. There was no specific target, the rounds simply screamed out over the waves and splashed down somewhere really, really far away. The objective was to prove the whole integrated system worked in a maritime environment. These were questions you can only answer by actually going out to sea and testing the thing. And the results were good enough to move forward. After the initial sea trials, the program shifted into what Atlas calls the gun system phase, working toward continuous fire capability, improving projectile stability, and integrating fire control systems that could track targets and adjust aim in real time. The railgun had proven it could fire from a ship. Now it needed to prove it could actually hit something. Summer 2025, the real milestone. In mid-2025, at Atlas' annual Defense Technology Symposium, Japan revealed that Asuka's railgun had fired and hit an actual target vessel under tow. The symposium materials included images of a barge-like ship peppered with impact holes, clear evidence that hypersonic projectiles launched from a moving warship had found their mark many, many times. Real gun on a real ship, firing real rounds at a real target floating in the ocean and hitting it. The details showed a picture of a weapon system that was genuinely maturing. Muzzle velocities during the sea trials ranged from 2,000 to 2,300 meters per second, achieved consistently across multiple firings. The fin-stabilized darts maintained stable hypersonic flight throughout their trajectories. Danish radar firm Weibel Scientific, which provided instrumentation for the tests, confirmed their equipment to track projectiles at hypersonic speeds over engagement ranges of several kilometers. The rounds were flying true, they were hitting where they were aimed, and the barrels were surviving. For a technology that defeated some of the world's best-funded defense programs, that was a remarkable combination to achieve. But here's the question that hangs over all of this. Railguns have reached promising stages before, and they've stalled before. So what makes Japan's program different? What are they doing that might actually get this weapon across the finish line? Part of it comes down to a design philosophy that diverges sharply from what the Americans tried. The US Navy railgun program aimed big, really big. They were chasing a 150mm, 32 megajoule monster capable of hurling guided projectiles over 100 nautical miles, essentially replacing traditional naval gunfire support with an electromagnetic alternative. The requirements called for high rates of fire and barrel lives measured in thousands of rounds, specifications that pushed the technology far beyond what anyone had actually demonstrated. Japan looked at that approach and went the other direction. Their 40mm gun wasn't designed to replace battleship bombardment, it was designed for defense and medium-range strike. The focus is on intercepting incoming missiles and engaging surface targets at ranges measured in kilometers rather than hundreds of kilometers. And that difference matters enormously from an engineering standpoint. Managing a 5 megajoule shot is hard. Managing a 32 megajoule shot is really a lot harder. And it's not just 6 times harder, it's exponentially harder. There's just ways that it gets more complicated across every subsystem. The capacitors need to store more energy, the rails need to handle more currents, the barrel takes more punishment with every firing. By starting smaller and focusing on a more achievable goal, Japan reduced the engineering risk at every stage. They built something that actually works, proved it at sea, and now have a foundation that they can scale up over time. Atlas' development plan calls for eventually reaching around 20 megajoules per shot, which would mean significantly higher velocities and longer ranges. But they're walking there, nice and slow. Flight, stability, and fire control challenge. Okay, so getting a projectile out of the barrel at Mach 6 is only half the problem. The other half is making sure it actually goes where you pointed it. Railgun rounds leave the muzzle at enormous speeds, but that speed works against them if the projectile isn't aerodynamically stable. A round that begins to wobble or tumble loses energy rapidly and its trajectory becomes unpredictable. At hypersonic velocities, even tiny asymmetries in shape or weight distribution compound into major deviations by the time the round reaches its target. The fin-stabilized darts Atlas has developed address this through careful shaping and small stabilizing fins that deploy after launch, keeping the rounds flying point first rather than tumbling end over end. As far as anyone can tell from public information, Japan's current projectiles are unguided. No onboard sensors, no steering fins, no terminal guidance, just a precisely shaped piece of metal relying on its initial aim and hypersonic speed to reach the target. That puts enormous pressure on the fire control system to get the trajectory right from the start, because once the round leaves the barrel, there's no correcting course. But Japan has decades of experience developing advanced radar and fire control systems for its Aegis-equipped destroyers, including the domestically produced FCS-3 and OPS-48 radar suites, systems that were, as it happens, destined to board the Asuka before they entered frontline service. The Asuka is a really, really busy boat. Integrating a railgun into that existing ecosystem of sensors and targeting computers is still a significant challenge, but Japan isn't starting from scratch. The building blocks are already sitting in dockyards and design offices across the country. What the railgun's for? Okay, fantastic. The gun works. But proving a weapon functions is different from proving it's useful. So where would Japan actually deploy this thing? Well, the most obvious application is air and missile defense. Instead of firing a multi-million-dollar interceptor at every incoming cruise missile, drone, or hypersonic threat, you fire a hypersonic metal dart that costs a tiny fraction as much. The idea is to create an additional layer in the defensive stack, something that sits alongside conventional missile interceptors, taking shots that would otherwise drain the ship's expensive missile inventory. Against a saturation attack involving dozens of incoming threats, the ability to engage some of them with cheap, fast, plentiful railgun rounds could be the difference between surviving the salvo and running out of interceptors halfway through. The key word there is could. Hitting a maneuvering missile at Mach 3 or faster is significantly harder than hitting a ship under tow. But if Japan can make it work, even partially, the strategic implications are significant. And here's where it all comes together strategically. If China's doctrine relies on overwhelming Japanese and allied ships with more missiles than they have interceptors, then adding a layer of cheap, fast, plentiful railgun shots to this defensive mix dilutes that strategy. As for where the railgun might actually end up, Japan has been relatively open about its ambitions. Defense analysts and official documents point to several potential platforms: future large destroyers, sometimes referred to by the provisional designation 13DDX, which could be designed from the outset with the power generation to accommodate electromagnetic weapons, land-based batteries for island and coastal defense as well. And if Atla hits its miniaturization targets, even vehicle-mounted systems could potentially become possible. But all of that lies in the future. Right now, the Asuka remains the only platform carrying a working railgun. The experimental ship is the stepping stone, and the stones she's laying down lead toward a very different kind of navy. But will it actually end up in use? I mean, we've seen these things come and go many times. Research on future railgun program continues through the mid-2020s, with stated aims of deploying a small caliber anti-ship prototype around 2027 and a medium caliber by 2028. That's a lot of progress, but skepticism persists in some defense circles about whether railguns make sense at all compared to the alternatives. Improved missiles keep getting better, and they have the advantage of being mature, proven technology. High-energy lasers are advancing rapidly and don't have barrel wear problems. Some analysts argue that the money going into railguns might be better spent accelerating those other systems instead. Japan has clearly decided that the bet is worth making, though. They've cleared hurdles that have defeated better-funded programs and demonstrated capabilities that nobody else has matched. But credible roadmap and deployed weapon system, they're different things. And the gap between them is filled with a shitload of challenges. Thank you for watching.